Hi, welcome. I'm Tom Fitton, President of Judicial Watch, which is a special educational panel on the first 100 days and anti-corruption agenda. We have an expert panel joining us live here in our studio today. Thank you for those of you joining us on Facebook Live and elsewhere. This is a historic opportunity to clean up government corruption over the next few years with a new administration and a new Congress, and we'll be talking about that here today. Those of you who don't know, Judicial Watch is a nonpartisan educational foundation dedicated to exposing and prosecuting government corruption. We've been founded in 1994, and we've gone after the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and we'll see what will happen with the Trump administration. But we all know that corruption doesn't disappear just because there's a change in administrations. Judicial Watch has become well known for our work on the Clinton email scandal. We exposed the Clinton emails, we exposed the Clinton pay-for-play scandal at the State Department, and the consequences of that obviously were severe for Mrs. Clinton, not necessarily legally, but the voters obviously were educated about what went on and made some decisions on Election Day that did not benefit her, evidently. So the big decision for Mr. Trump now is what to do with the Clinton scandals, what to do with cleaning up government corruption. He promised to drain the swamp, and he's coming into a city that has a lot of park rangers for that swamp, so it's going to be a challenge. And of course now he has a Congress that is controlled by his own party, and so independent observers are going to be concerned that one party isn't going to be able to police itself well in terms of the legislative branch analyzing the executive branch. So those of us who are principled and independent are going to be aware of the fact that the Trump administration is not going to have the typical oversight that we would expect from a legislative branch controlled by the opposite party. So an additional challenge for Americans concerned about government corruption. But what to do about the Clinton scandals, I think, and Judicial Watch thinks generally that obviously there needs to be a serious investigation of what went on with the national security implications, the government records implications, the pay-for-play implications with the Clinton scandals. It wasn't just about Hillary Clinton. It was about the President Obama's misconduct, the FBI's misconduct, the Justice Department's misconduct, the State Department's misconduct. It's also about crony capitalism and cronyism with our corporate culture, giving money obviously to the Clinton Foundation, and of course you had the foreign influence peddling that was going on as well. So this scandal isn't just about Mrs. Clinton. So in the least, Mr. Trump should think about draining the swamp, this scandal being about draining the swamp. It's not just about Hillary Clinton, it's about the corrupt DC culture generally, and the least he can do is take the political thumb off the scales that is currently there under the Obama administration and allow the Justice Department and the FBI to proceed and prosecute, well, specifically to investigate and then, if necessary, to prosecute. The problem under the prior administration is no one believed the investigation was serious, so the resulting decision not to prosecute obviously was lacking. But there are all sorts of other scandals to be uncovered, and there has to be accountability. I tell you, at the State Department, whether or not Giuliani is the pick is not relevant to me personally, but I like the idea of a prosecutor being put in charge of the State Department, because public policies are going to be changed, legislation is going to happen, you're going to get taxes cut probably, Obamacare repealed thankfully, and there'll be policy changes on the conservative side of the ledger. But the real political capital needs to be spent on cleaning up government corruption. So that means focusing appointees on the fact that the agencies have been out of control, they think they're above the law, they think they're not transparent, they don't think they have to be transparent and accountable to the American people. So we need hard-charging sheriffs running those agencies to bring them back up, bring them back down to under control of the United States people, the United States voters who really want this corruption in Washington addressed. And to that end, I think one way to think about this is Judicial Watch will continue our investigations no matter what. Our litigation will continue. All those lawsuits we have pending for the Clinton emails and other records against the Obama administration will soon be defended by the Trump administration, so they're going to have to figure out whether they're going to continue the gamesmanship and obstruction that we've been facing from the agencies to date. But on top of that, we should think about all the other scandals for which there needs to be accountability. Solyndra, Fast and Furious, Benghazi, the IRS. And I think we should think about appointing a truth commission of some type. Maybe Congress can have a select committee. Maybe there could be a commission along the lines of the 9/11 Commission with subpoena power and serious investigative heft to go after and expose and maybe refer for prosecution these scandals that went uninvestigated, such as the pay-for-play that went on with Solyndra and the green energy programs, the hundreds of people killed by Fast and Furious guns, the IRS scandal, which continues to this day, Benghazi, for which, because of the obstruction of the email scandal by Hillary Clinton, we still don't have all the answers to, and of course the email scandal itself. Well, to discuss all that today, we have about the best panel one could have to talk about a topic like this. Joining me first is Congressman Jim Jordan. Congressman Jordan was elected in 2006. He represents the 4th District of Ohio, which is, what's the big town there? Lima? Lima, Ohio. And Congressman Jordan is known as one of the fiercest investigators in Congress, well known as chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, which is the, I guess, the conservative outgrowth of the original conservative House Republican Conference, or Conference Committee. Fair. So he's the conservative of the conservatives in Congress, and now he's chairman emeritus of the House Freedom Caucus, and he just turned over the keys to the kingdom there to Mark Meadows yesterday. But you may recall his excellent questioning of Mrs. Clinton from his service on the House Benghazi Committee, and he's been so much an ally of those of us who want clean government in Washington in terms of getting Congress finally to do its job, so we'll be pleased to hear from him. Also joining us is Mark Krikorian, our friend from the Center for Immigration Studies. Mark is an expert on immigration issues, and he served as executive director of the CIS for how many years now?
22 years.
Only 22 years. And the Center is an independent, nonpartisan research organization here in Washington, D.C. It examines and critiques the impact of immigration on the United States. And, you know, Mark's vision and knowledge is a resource that is unique here in Washington. He's sought by members of Congress and the media. You can read him on National Review. And his Center for Immigration Studies is the go-to source for information about the immigration crisis. And I think it's fair to say the Center for Immigration Studies advocates a rule of law approach to immigration and questions the truisms or the big lies that we have here in Washington on the immigration issue. And obviously Mr. Trump made his mark or made his name on promises to combat illegal immigration, so I'll be interested to hear what Mark has to say in a bit. Also joining us is our own Ramona Cotca, who is a lawyer, a senior attorney here at Judicial Watch. She's been with us since 2013. Prior to that, she was part of a Fortune 500 in-house counsel team, and she's went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor undergraduate, and she received her law degree from AU in 2004. Now, Ramona, you know, I get to go on and talk about all the great work our lawyers like Ramona do, and Ramona's been in the middle of the IRS scandal. It was her case that has exposed pretty much everything we know about the IRS scandal, and it was her diligence in the Benghazi litigation efforts that helped expose the Clinton email issue, and I hope you to give us the background on that. But if there's a heroine in the effort to hold the IRS and the State Department and Mrs. Clinton accountable, Ramona is certainly one of those heroines. Also joining us, and we're honored to be joined by the former Attorney General for the United States, General Edwin Meese. Mr. Meese was Attorney General under President Clinton. He's
President Reagan.
Excuse me, President Reagan. President Clinton wishes you were Attorney General under President Reagan, and he's a Ronald Reagan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And Mr. Meese did not go quietly into the night after his leaving the Reagan administration. He's been active in the conservative movement since then. From his perch at the Heritage Foundation, he is virtually he has really inculcated the legal public interest efforts on the part of the conservative movement, and his work on behalf of a constitutional judiciary, one that follows the law and applies the law as opposed to creates it, has been historic. And so, and of course, Mr. Meese, having worked for Mr. Reagan, has seen a transition or two, and can give us some guidance as to what a new president should be doing to get the government back under control, because I think the comparisons to Reagan and Trump, there are obviously differences in outlook, but I think the political situation they're coming into is somewhat similar, so it's going to be interesting to hear what Mr. Meese's insights here on that are. And also joining us is Andy McCarthy, another great friend of Judicial Watch. He's a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. This is the district that should have been prosecuting Hillary Clinton. He led the 1995 terrorism prosecution against the blind sheik Omar Abdel, Rahman, and 11 others, and he convicted them, more importantly. Yeah. And he also contributed to the prosecution of the terrorists who bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He's a contributing editor at National Review and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, whose critiques and analysis of law and order issues and the war on terrorism has been so important to really shaping the outlook that we now may be seeing more out of from a Trump administration. So with that all being said, we're going to open the panel up to some opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion among ourselves. Again, thank you. You're watching Judicial Watch's Facebook Live event, and otherwise an event which is being nationally distributed on the first 100 days, the anti-corruption agenda. And we'll begin with the Congressman Jordan.
Tom, thank you, and Ramona and Judicial Watch for all the great work that you've done. Let me start with a scenario that I think captures what took place on Election Day. And this could play out in countless neighborhoods across the country this afternoon. There's a guy who works second shift. Now remember, you work second shift, you miss half your kids' Little League games, you miss some of their after-school activities. But he's a hardworking individual, goes out to get in his truck to drive to work. And as he's getting in his truck, he looks a couple houses down, and he sees a guy sitting on the front porch, drinking coffee and reading the paper. And the second shift worker knows the front porch sitter can work and won't work and is getting his money. He gets in his truck to drive to work. He turns on the radio, happens to be the news hour. The reporter comes on and says the federal government's got a $20 trillion debt, and they got this program that gives special money to some favored corporation. Some company went bankrupt and cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. He hears all that, remembers what he saw back on the front porch, and guess what? He's ticked off, and he has every right to be. Same time he's driving to work, there's a lady driving home from work. She's a second-grade teacher at the local school. She, like all good teachers, views her job as a mission field. She has spent her day working hard to help her students get the education they need. She's driving home, has her radio on, happens to be on the same station, hears the same reporter talk about a $20 trillion debt the country has, a program that gives money to favored corporations. This company went bankrupt, cost the taxpayers millions. She hears all that as she pulls into her drive, which happens to be on the same street. She sees the same guy sitting on the front porch, drinking his coffee, reading the paper. She knows he can work and won't work and is getting her money. And guess what? She's mad too, and she has every right to be. I would argue that on November 8th, second shift workers, second grade teachers said enough. We are tired of this town catering to special interest groups, catering to the crony capitalism mindset around here, and we're tired of this town having the double standard, what you've worked to expose. There's one set of rules for us regular folk and a different set of rules for the politically connected like Hillary Clinton and John Koskinen. And they said enough. And I know they did it in our state. I mean, did anyone think that Donald Trump would win Ohio by 8.5%? And so our task in the first 100 days, real simple: reform welfare, incentivize work, get rid of Obamacare. I believe health care will be better and cheaper when Obamacare is gone. Secure the border, and then focus on the things that are going to help our economy. But ultimately, in the end, so many people, I think, also were focused in this election about adherence to the rule of law, and as you said in your opening comments, Tom, making sure the Justice Department is focused on justice and not on politics. And right now, we know it's the opposite. There should be one standard, equal treatment under the law, not a double standard. And so to that effect, we have to continue the investigations, because we're either going to have equal treatment under the law or we're going to have a double standard. And that's why I'm focused on doing just that. And frankly, The last thing I'll say is this: it's why we need to hold people accountable. John Koskinen needs to be held accountable for his conduct when he was brought in to clean up the IRS, and he hasn't done so.
And he's the IRS commissioner?
Current commissioner. In fact, later today on the House floor, we will make the motion to impeach Mr. Koskinen. We think the American people want folks in high office held accountable when they engage in egregious behavior, as Mr. Koskinen has, and so we're committed to doing that here the last few days of this session.
So describe you use the word impeachment, and we get excited because that's a major tool that Congress hasn't used. It's been in the offing against Mr. Koskinen for well over a year now. There was a hearing, but isn't Congress leaving in a minute and a half, relatively speaking?
Yeah.
So what's going to happen?
You make the motion, it has to be dealt with in 2 legislative days, and so we'll make the motion. It could be tabled, it could be voted on, it could be referred to committee. But impeachment is a privileged motion for this very reason, because it's so important when you have conduct as, the type of conduct that Mr. Koskinen engaged in when he was brought in as commissioner. We think this is the only remedy. We've tried everything else. We have tried to get more hearings. We have tried to look at the censure issue and all kinds of other things. We feel like when nothing is being done, this is why you have this privileged motion, and we feel like we have to offer it today.
Well, congratulations on that, and this will obviously be a test for the Republican leadership. This is, I'm sure, something they don't want to deal with. They didn't want to impeach him to begin with. That's why you've had to resort to doing this at the last minute like you are. But thank you, Congressman Jordan. We'll come back to that issue. General Meese, tell us what you think, how things are going, how they ought to go, and your reaction to the corruption crisis that I'm sure has caused you great concern given your role at the Justice Department in the Reagan administration.
Well, thank you, Tom. And like Jim, I'd like to congratulate you and the Judicial Watch. It just amazes me how you can get more information than either anybody in the government, including the inspectors general, and more than the news media. And certainly what Judicial Watch has brought to the attention of the American public is, I think, was absolutely critical in the last election, so that people knew what was going on. But I'd like to say that there's a lot to be done about the Justice Department, about the whole government. For example, the first threat to public safety that needs to be corrected is the attitude of this administration, which has been hostile to police throughout the entire 8 years of Obama's reign. And as a result, the police officers feel both threatened and also disappointed. I chaired a roundtable of all the major police organizations in the country, International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Sheriff's Association, several others, just last week. And that was the uniform feeling among the police officers who are working the streets, that they don't feel that the federal government has their back anymore, as it normally has had in the past. Certainly during the Reagan administration, that was a big theme of ours. For example, this hostility towards police was reflected in an order signed by the president that the military could not give surplus safety equipment to police departments, which are always under-resourced in their local governments, and the government was helping out with certain equipment that would protect them in these very urgent situations, hostage situations, situations where criminals are barricaded, shooting at police officers, and equipment like these armored vehicles or helmets, things like that, that certainly are defensive for police officers, were being taken away rather than being given, and this is surplus material that the Army has. Likewise, the investigations of police officers and police departments by the so-called Civil Rights Division. I think one of the things that the President ought to do, and the new Attorney General, is to take investigations of police out of the Civil Rights Division entirely. That is, quite frankly, the worst cesspool of liberal lawyers in the entire government, and that's something that absolutely has to happen. Beyond that, we now have the Department of Justice engaging in extortion. They will file suit against a bank or some other business and then tell them, well, we won't take you to trial as long as you give an amount of money to this organization or that organization, which turns out to be some pet organization of the head of that division of the Justice Department, but is almost invariably a liberal organization which couldn't get their money legitimately from the federal government, and they're getting it there in that way. So it literally is nothing less than extortion. It seems to me that any monies that are collected as a result of wrongdoing, first of all, ought to be adjudicated in a fair way so that people are not being held up against their will or given an easy out to go through this administrative process. Instead, if they're doing wrong, they ought to be charged, tried, and then given an appropriate penalty. And if the penalty is a fine, it ought to go into the Treasury and not to somebody else. Beyond that, I think there's another thing. We have all kinds of money going to private organizations that are there for political purposes, and they get their grants through a number of different agencies in the federal government, whether it's Department of the Interior, Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services. There's all kinds of money going out. And I believe there is real crony capitalism or crony corruption, if you will, in where these monies are going. And that ought to stop. I think Congress and the Inspectors General ought to get together. You know, the Inspectors General do report both to their agency, but they also render the information to the Congress and track down what these organizations are, where this money is going, and take them out of the budget. We should not have taxpayer money going to fund political organizations. So I think these are some of the things that I hope will happen during the first 100 days. You know, one of the things about it, this is the time that a president really has the opportunity to do things. I remember President Reagan utilizing that time to get his tax reform program going, and particularly the tax reduction program. It's the time that he started the regulatory reforms that the vice president was put in charge of. It's the time that he started to build up the military, which was in such bad shape in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So that's the opportunity that this president has. And so some of the things that I've said, some of the things that Jim has mentioned, those are the things to get started right immediately while you might say, the political capital is at its highest level, and while the people still remember why it was that they voted for the new president.
The title, obviously, the panel is the first 100 days. Obviously, you mentioned that. It's obviously the kind of a thumbnail description of the opportunities in the beginning of administration. But how long do you think he has, or an administration has, in terms of the ability to get things passed and done in an aggressive way before the next election starts kicking in?
Well, you know, last time it seemed like in 2012 that the next election started the day after the inauguration.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised that'll be the case now. But I think it's up to the president. And I think this president who is coming into office, I think has the personality to get public attention behind him far beyond the first 100 days. But the important thing is to get it off to a good start and to let the people know that there is a change coming and that there is a change being started, so that they continue the enthusiasm and continue to remember the reasons why they voted for this administration. And then I think there's at least the first real period is not 100 days, it's really 180 days, which is the time from inauguration on the 20th of January to the time in August when Congress goes on its major summer recess. That's the time when legislation needs to be introduced and a lot of it passed, if at all possible.
Thank you, Attorney General Meese. Andy McCarthy, prosecutor extraordinaire and commentator, expert commentator on the constitutional issues that have emerged during the Obama age and the national security threats. A lot on your plate to talk about, but I don't want to be so forward as to tell you both.
But I think you're quite correct to emphasize the first 100 days, because as General Meese says, that is the time to strike. And I think there may be a unique opportunity in this particular tee-up, because as I understand it, there are a number of seats, I think it's close to a couple of dozen, that Senate Democrats have to defend in the next cycle. So there may be, and many of them are places where Trump won. So there might be a unique opportunity to put some pressure and maybe get some accommodation on that score. And boy, do we need accommodation. I think the most important two things that I would like to see, and I hope it will happen in a tone-setting way, is that we have to get back to the top two obligations of the executive branch, which are faithfully executing the laws and protecting the national security of the United States. On the issue of faithfully executing the laws, I was so glad that Congressman Jordan talked about Koskinen and the impeachment proceeding. I was actually proud to testify at that hearing. And impeachment, which gets everybody's hackles up when the I word gets mentioned, the framers thought impeachment was, as they put it, the indispensable tool that was given to Congress for purposes of reining in a rogue executive branch. And, you know, that was one of the main concerns that the framers had in drafting the Constitution, to create a suitably, awesomely powerful presidency, but yet be able to control it, particularly given the potential for illegality and damage done to the country. There are really only two ways to control it. One of them is to use the power of the purse, and we'd love to see Congress do more of that. I think in particular, as General Meese mentioned, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is out of control. And I don't understand why on earth the Justice Department needs to have a $28 billion budget if they're going to use such a substantial part of it in order not only to shake down corporations and pursue a social justice warrior progressive agenda, but also basically to be on a jihad against the nation's police departments in order to pressure them into these consent decrees, which will essentially federalize the police force along the lines of what, you know, Obama, Holder, and Lynch want. The really tragic thing about the Justice Department in the last 8 years is that we've gone from what we aspire the Justice Department to be, which is something that bolsters the rule of law, to what it's become, which is something that realizes that the law can be used as a weapon and that the process is often the penalty. So what you get is, you know, the Justice Department goes into these small states and targets their police departments. They often slipstream behind one of these controversial police encounter events that have commanded so much attention in the last few years. They know there's no way that they can bring a civil rights case. Anyone who understands the civil rights law knows that those are laughable. But they use the controversy, whether it's in Ferguson or, you know, the many other ones that they've used, to slipstream in behind, and then they start to do an investigation of the police department. So you have some place like Jefferson, Missouri, trying to compete with a Justice Department that has a bottomless budget, and they know they can't do it. Right. So what ends up happening, of course, is they have to surrender, and they surrender on the terms that the Justice Department pushes them on. So I think that has to stop, and Congress has to stop allowing them, giving them the resources to go to war against the cops. I mean, that really has to stop. I think on the national security front, two things to say about that. One, I think it would be important to move the legislation that would designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. A lot of information came out of the really the biggest terrorism financing trial the Justice Department has ever done, the Holy Land Foundation case back in 2007, 2008, which showed that there is a Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy in the West and in the United States, not only to support Hamas, but to undermine the West. In their own words, they call it a grand jihad to eliminate and destroy Western civilization from within. And I'm quoting their own paperwork, right? It's probably too stale at this point to go after all of the Islamist organizations that were designated as unindicted co-conspirators in that case, because the indictment was 2004. So I get asked all the time, can those organizations be pursued? The statute of limitations is probably all long run. But I do think if you designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, which would be following, by the way, the countries that know them the best, you know, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, have all taken action against the Muslim Brotherhood. What that would do is start the clock over again with respect to all these different Islamist organizations, because now they would be put to a choice about whether they are going to be our allies in the ideological battle over radical Islam, or whether they're going to continue to support the Muslim Brotherhood, in which case there'll be some peril to them. So I'd like to see that move forward. But the other thing, and I'll close on this, is that we need to remember that most of the struggle that we have, especially in confronting Sharia supremacist ideology, which is what fuels the terrorist threat against us, is cultural. And there's a limit to how much can be done, whether it's by law or by politics in Washington, to solve that. Most of that has to take place in the public domain, which is why I've tried to, over the years, do what I could to expose the threat. Because I think the biggest problem we have, and this is, I think, the biggest asset Trump brings to the table, is political correctness. These people need to be exposed, they need to be spotlighted, because I'm convinced that if they had to defend the tenets of radical Islam in the public square, in the court of public opinion, they wouldn't be able to do it, and they'd be marginal figures in our culture.
Right. Well, thank you, Andy. A lot to do there. Just on, and that's just only one aspect of the national security crisis we're facing. A related aspect of it is the immigration battles that Mark has been in the center of through his Center for Immigration Studies. Other than locking her up, building a wall was, Trump's most famous campaign promise. And obviously, there are a lot of issues related to immigration that he has to address because of Obama's lawlessness. If you could give us a path forward for him, path forward for anyone in his position, that would be nice.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And I just want to express a nation's gratitude to you and Ramona and your whole team. And I just suggest check under your car before you turn on the ignition.
Don't give anyone any ideas.
So there's a lot that has to be done, obviously, in immigration, and a lot of it is long-term stuff, and some of it, frankly, is based on honest differences of opinion. But the contempt for the rule of law in this administration on the immigration issue is just breathtaking. And there's a lot of things that the new administration can do right away. First is just changing the climate, because the assumption really under this administration is that immigration law is something to apologize for, that really everybody in the world is kind of allowed to come here. I mean, that's kind of the way these guys look at it. And that is obviously going to change at noon on the 20th of January. But specifically, there's 5 things I want to talk about: executive orders and memos and directives and edicts and all the rest of that the president has used to govern. And this isn't just immigration. You saw it in EPA and healthcare and elsewhere, but immigration specifically, this president basically has openly said, Congress won't give me what I want, so I'm just going to do it anyway. The most egregious example of that is the initials are DACA. It's the amnesty for about 750,000 illegal immigrants who came here before they turned 16. And whether that's a good idea or not, I mean, I think you can actually discuss that. The president just said he's going to do it on his own. A Democratic Congress voted that down in 2010, and he just went ahead and did it anyway, giving them work permits, Social Security numbers. This isn't just looking the other way. This was actually amnestying them, even though it's a temporary amnesty. That's got to end. And even other of these edicts and rulings and what have you from the administration that aren't necessarily illegal, for instance, under the pretext of prosecutorial discretion, basically you have to prioritize resources. They've used that as a pretext to exempt the large majority of illegal immigrant population from the workings of the law. I just testified a few months ago before the Senate, and the head of the Border Patrol Agents Union, the field agents, he said that at least 80% of the people the Border Patrol apprehends, they have to let go into the United States. So that is, again, something that they can start ending right away. Sanctuary cities is another thing Trump talked about in the campaign. Everybody gets that, not just cities, really, counties, states. And there, again, the administration, the Attorney General in this case, can start with just cut off Justice Department funding. That's not going to do it on its own, because a lot of these cities and the state of California have said they'll go without the money. So that's going to be a challenge that's going to extend well into next year, but you start it right away by turning off the money and sort of setting a red line. The other thing, and this is something that really is outrageous, is all these releases of convicted criminals. Since 2013, this administration has released almost 90,000 deportable convicted criminals. These are the ones who actually got convicted. There's a lot of other people who didn't get convicted, but who really are, they skipped bail or something like that. And there are almost 1 million people with orders of removal, final order of removal. In other words, they've been ordered deported, they've gone through the whole thing, and they just ran off. And nobody's looking for them in this administration. So again, changing those priorities. You're not going to find all 900,000+ absconders from deportation in 100 days, but you start the process right away. Refugees is another area that, you know, actually does involve to some degree money corruption as well as the kind of corruption of the rule of law, because we have a refugee program. It's provided for in the laws, the Refugee Act of 1980, but we admit as refugees all kinds of people who aren't refugees. Just the Ohio State jihad slasher, he came with his family from Pakistan. He was already settled in Pakistan from Somalia. How he possibly could be justified as a refugee, I have no idea. Again, that's something you can at least start changing right away. And the last point I wanted to bring up is legal immigration. There's a lot there, and Congress mainly is the one that has to actually change the law. But there's a lot of things, and just one example, that the administration can do quickly. There's a visa called the H-1B visa. People who follow this will be familiar with it, but it's a supposedly temporary visa for basically the computer industry. I mean, there's a lot of different things, but it's basically people from India working in computers, and they're mostly cheap labor for these tech companies. Disney just recently, some of you may be familiar with Disney, this was about a year ago or so now, replaced its entire U.S. American tech workforce with these H-1B foreign workers and made the Americans train the foreign workers as a condition of their getting severance. And a lot of companies have done this. Fossil did this. Utility companies have done this. Disney was the one that got the New York Times' attention, therefore it's the one that matters, I guess. But that's something that administration can change on its own, at least reform significantly, tighten that up so that even though they can't change the wording of the law, they can apply the law in such a way that makes that much more difficult to do. And you know, for the benefit of American workers, the way the law is supposed to be designed. So there's a lot of work on immigration, but there are a lot of things, everything can be started in the first 100 days, and some of the things can actually be achieved and, you know, resolved in the first 100 days.
Thank you, Mark. A lot to be done there. A transparency revolution, it seems to me, needs to be on the list of Mr. Trump's things to do once he gets here in Washington. And Judicial Watch, we've had over 3,000 Freedom of Information Act requests filed against this administration, probably upwards of 300 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, some of which gained some important information on the IRS, on Benghazi, led to the appointment of the Select Committee, and certainly Mrs. Clinton knows some of the other results of our investigations as well. And a lawyer at the center of many of these lawsuits has been our own Ramona Cotca, who's here to discuss where those lawsuits are now, where they've been, and where they're going.
Sure. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Well, first, I'd just like to say that it's my honor to be on this panel with the distinguished panelists. But with respect to where we are in FOIA and the cases that we've had, I would say actually what I would, as a practicing attorney against the government attorneys, is to actually get a culture where transparency and the agencies, whether it's the State Department or the DOJ, the attorneys, actually follow the rule of law, that really the public does have a right to know of what its government is up to and what it's doing. So two great examples of that would be the Benghazi and the IRS cases that we've had. They're still going, so we will see what happens in the next 100 days or the next administration with respect to how they handle these cases. But just as background, Tom, as you may recall, when Benghazi happened, the attacks happened, one of my first cases at Judicial Watch was actually filing a lawsuit for the talking points that was provided to Ambassador Susan Rice to the UN. And immediately following the Sunday after the attack, she went onto the talk shows for the morning shows and continue to highlight this idea that it was a protest. The attack happened sort of sporadically out of a protest, blaming a YouTube video. In 2012, when it happened, I wasn't at Judicial Watch at the time, but I was watching it on CNN, and I didn't believe what the reporters were reporting, that it was, this is just me while I was still in private practice. So we filed a lawsuit, and that was the case where we got some records, and one being with the email between Ben Rhodes from the White House with Ambassador Rice's office and other State Department officials, telling her to highlight that the reason for the attack was the YouTube video, which we know was false, and the government at the time, the officials knew that it was false. But Tom, as you may recall, we were looking at that case, we were ready to dismiss it and to settle it out, and we said, where are Hillary Clinton's emails in all of this? So even though the Benghazi Select Committee had already been formed at the time, we continued and filed a new FOIA request and a new lawsuit for the talking points, but this was directly to her office. And that really has spiraled and led into multiple FOIA requests and lawsuits that we have filed, and leading to 2 cases where we've had in which the courts have agreed with us that discovery is necessary to find out what happened with respect to the records within the State Department, and also producing them on the subject matters of why we initially filed the lawsuits. So that's one of the things I guess I would just highlight is in these litigations that we're having, we're trying to get records on this particular subject matter, whether it's IRS targeting or Benghazi or the reason for the Benghazi attacks. But then they're spiraling into all this litigation that's happening because of the agency's lack of forthcoming to the courts, to us as a plaintiff, in telling us what they're doing to search for the records. Do they have the records? Are the records being destroyed while we are pending in litigation? That's been our experience so far. In the IRS, we did have Judge Sullivan, who did threaten one of the DOJ attorneys when they did violate his court order in producing records, as Judge Sullivan ordered them to do. Since then,
He also threatened to put the commissioner in jail, too.
he did, but since then, I will say, the IRS has produced records on a timely basis.
Funny how that works.
Correct. So I would say, we're going to continue doing what we have been doing without going in much more background on these issues, but it would be interesting to see if the culture actually changes from the agencies as also the attorneys representing the agencies.
So what could they do specifically? I mean, all these lawsuits that we have, we are seeking discovery, we're seeking records, we're battling over records that have been withheld. Yeah, I mean, what would be, if you could wave your magic wand with the agencies or Justice Department attorneys representing them, what would their new legal positions be in a Trump administration?
Well, very simple. We have a brief due this week, Tom, and we are fighting on something so basic, and it seems nonsensical to me. It's in one of the Benghazi cases that we have, and we've asked for Secretary Clinton's emails about the Benghazi attack. The State Department has searched some of her senior advisors' records that were returned to the State Department from their unofficial accounts. Ms. Abedin, Ms. Mills, as well as Jacob Sullivan, returned records from their unofficial accounts. The State Department, now State Department's admitted that these are senior officials who the Secretary has communicated with about the Benghazi attacks. They're refusing, and they've refused to search their official State Department accounts, email accounts. So we have to go to the courts and litigate that. So we're getting their federal records from their unofficial email accounts, but we're not getting their federal records from their official email accounts. So
A return to normalcy.
it would be nice, yes, just common sense approach would be one.
If I could share a story, Tom, and I appreciate it because the Rose Memo was, as you right, your great work is what prompted the formation of the committee. But I remember when we first learned that Paul Combetta and Pagliano had got immunity deals. The committee asked to see the immunity agreements the Justice Department gave those, and this isn't part of the email situation. Pagliano's the guy who set up the server. Initially, Combetta's the guy who worked for Platte River Networks, the group to handle the server. So we asked to see, the committee asked to see the actual agreements the Justice Department entered into with these individuals. And in the course of looking at those, one of the lawyers on the committee staff said, well, did anyone else get immunity? And now remember, the Justice Department made us view these in camera. We couldn't take them. We had to come into the committee room, and they had to open the folder and show them to the committee. Someone asked, "Is there any more?" And they said, "Well, yeah, there's some more." And we're like, "Well, why didn't you bring them? We actually wanted all of them." And they said, "Well, we can't." And I said, "Can you get them? Can we get them now?" No, we'll get them next week. So we had to come back a week later, Friday afternoon. We were getting ready to go home, and it was at 10 o'clock. And I walked in about 10:05. and the same Justice Department lady slid the folder over to me. It was one of those moments I will never forget in my career, because I opened up the folder and I started reading, and I just stopped. It's one of those where your jaw drops, and I looked up and I said, "You gave Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson immunity?" I mean, it was when we found out. Who would have thought they were going to? So this is the kind of Justice Department that we've been experiencing, the lack of transparency. That has got to change for the American people. It was, again, I literally, it's your jaw drops. You're like, you gave Cheryl Mills immunity. Who would have thought it?
Can I also add on this? You know, you always have to be careful, especially in the national security context, and there was classified information involved in this investigation, that as the Justice Department lawyers, you're withholding the classified information because you want to have fair litigation, but you also need to withhold what needs to be withheld. But what Congressman Jordan's talking about, these are cookie cutter agreements. Now, it's highly, highly unusual to give somebody immunity in this context, but why on earth they made you go to a separate location to read something when, in fact, if you go online, you could probably get the form that the Justice Department uses. It's clearly, the fact is, it wasn't so much the terms. They wanted to withhold from the public what it was they were doing and who they gave immunity to. And we talked before about the penalty, the process being the penalty when you're targeting someone who you want accommodations for. It's also the reward and a way of obfuscating on behalf of your allies. So what happened in the investigation we're talking about is, Prosecutor 101 is that when you have a serious felony suspicion in an investigation, you convene a grand jury. You may not see the grand jury, but as a prosecutor, I don't know how many thousands of times I reached into my desk and pulled out a subpoena and handed it to an agent and told him to go subpoena this or that. You don't even think about it. That's what's done.
Right.
In this case, they wouldn't convene a grand jury, which meant that they deprived the FBI of the ability to compel information. And that's the reason for all these cockamamie immunity agreements.
Have you ever seen a case? I bet Attorney General Meese has never seen a case where the subject of the investigation's husband gets to meet with the Attorney General 3 days before the FBI interviews the subject of the investigation, where no grand jury is convened, where 5 people get immunity, and yet no one gets prosecuted. 3 of the 5 who get immunity come in front of Congress and take the 5th. One of them doesn't even bother to show up even though he was subpoenaed. He just said, to heck with you guys. I mean, have you ever seen a case like this? And so when the second grade teacher and the second shift worker look at all this, plus everything else they see wrong in Washington, no wonder they were upset, and no wonder they voted the way they did.
Mr. Attorney General,
I never see that. All those things, the irregularities that you pointed out, but also I've never seen the FBI saying, if you'll give us your hard drive, we'll destroy it for you.
Yeah, I got to add that to my list.
well, it's no coincidence that, I've said repeatedly, when it comes to public policy, the Department of Justice is a locus of evil. And I have no doubt that the attacks and the smears and the slanders on Senator Jeff Sessions, Trump's pick for Attorney General, aren't designed to keep him from keep him away from the office. He's going to win. He's going to get the votes necessary. It's designed to keep him away from doing all the work we're talking about here on immigration, on law enforcement, on national security, on transparency, I hope. Republicans have a hot and cold view on transparency. They like it for others, but not for themselves. And certainly on the judiciary and civil rights, and Senator Sessions is famous for being a hard charger on law enforcement. And that's what this Sessions nomination battle is about. It's not whether he wins the nomination. It's a question of what he does afterwards, and they're prepping the battlefield.
Well, fortunately, Jeff Sessions is a very courageous man, a very good man, and all of his colleagues really know that he will make a fine Attorney General. And so it's going to test, I think, the conscience of the Senate, if you will, to see how much they go after him for pure political purposes.
Let me make a point about the Justice Department, because this touches on the IRS scandal. Again, impeachment on the offing for Koskinen. So if you're interested in this issue, you need to call your House members now. 224-3121, right? 202? 225-3121. 202-225-3121. But the public integrity section of the Justice Department investigates public corruption cases. And reportedly, they're telling the FBI they can't do anything other than look at press clips when investigating the Clinton Foundation, no subpoenas, no grand juries, no even witness interviews. But this is the same public integrity section that went and called Lois Lerner and said, we're thinking of ways to prosecute the very groups that you're suppressing. And they sent over the IRS to this public integrity section every tax file on every 501c4, quote, political group in the country. And your committee followed up on it, and it turned out the FBI had that material illicitly and turned it back over once they were caught. So these folks were figuring out ways to put Karl Rove in jail, but they don't want to investigate the in-your-face allegations of pay-to-play scandal, pay-to-play at the State Department and the Foundation.
Violation. The part of the law says you can't convey any confidential. There was some of that in those thousands of pages that were turned over.
It was, just to give it context as to the enormity and the number, it was over 1.25 million pages.
And so this is the agency that can't, that isn't going to let the FBI look at Mrs. Clinton.
Yeah, and you mentioned integrity, you know, with public integrity. I think we take it for granted, and we probably take it for granted less after the last 8 years, but the reason that we have a rule of law and the reason that the public accepts the legitimacy of the outcomes, not only from the Justice Department's investigations, but from court decisions, is that everybody thinks the government's playing by the rules, essentially. No one's saying mistakes don't get made, but they at least believe that when you take an oath to enforce the law, you're actually enforcing it, not using it as a political weapon. If people lose faith that that's the case, we have a lot more to worry about than just the cases we're talking about.
Mark, on the Justice Department or DHS as well, there's a lot that can be done that would allow, talk about the war on the police. If they cease the war on police, couldn't local police be enlisted to find these absconders? And would it be good for the Justice Department to stop suing states that are trying to vindicate federal law as opposed to
absolutely
obstructing it?
As to the first issue, the issue is not do police go out and do immigration enforcement, because they have their own thing they're doing. The question is, when in the normal course of their business they encounter people who turn out to be illegal aliens or deportable for some other reason, what do they do? And that's the reason this has become such a big issue, the sanctuary city issue, is because now DHS actually knows every time the police arrest somebody who's deportable. Because it used to be that, they did fingerprints the old-fashioned way, with ink or whatever, or even when they were scanned, they didn't go to DHS. They went to the FBI, and that's, everybody sort of understands, you do the fingerprints, and then they find out there's a warrant in another state for your arrest. What happened, started in the Bush administration, was completed in 2013. All fingerprints now are scanned, and they go both to the FBI and to DHS. So now Homeland Security actually knows about way more people who are deportable for one reason or another than ever did before. And so they then make a determination about whether they want this guy. This administration has raised the bar so high, you have to be, Osama bin Jihad for them to want to deport you. But the point is, the tool exists. When they inform the local jurisdiction, hey, if you're not going to prosecute this guy, please hold on to him because we want to pick him up, hold on to him 48 hours, we want to get him. What a sanctuary city is they say, yeah, sorry, no, we're just going to let him go. So that is the thing. It's not so much dragooning police to enforce immigration law. It's reestablishing the partnership between the state and local cops so that they can use immigration law for their own public safety purposes, which also overlaps with enforcement of immigration laws.
And when their politicians do that, they're not only violating federal law, but they're also endangering their own citizens. Because how many cases have we had? We've seen them, both drunk drivers, other kinds of criminals. We've seen them victimizing the same taxpayers that are paying the taxes on these cities, not to enforce the law.
That was the case with Kate Steinle, that poor girl who was killed in San Francisco that actually served almost as sort of rocket fuel for Donald Trump's campaign. And this issue of suing is kind of interesting, too, because just yesterday, California, the Democrats introduced legislation to shield illegal aliens, to use tax money to help them hire immigration lawyers and various other things. So this administration sued Arizona and other jurisdictions for helping enforce existing immigration law. And now, and the story then, remember, was this is purely a federal matter. States have no business getting involved. Now that the shoe's on the other foot, the very same people are saying, well, no, the local jurisdictions have to have authority of whether they're allowed to, whether they're interested in complying with federal immigration law. I mean, the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. But the effort to rein in these sanctuary jurisdictions is going to be hard, because just turning off some of their money isn't going to do it for at least a lot of the big ones. San Francisco, Chicago, they're not going to change just because they lost some, burn grant money or COPS program money.
Well, we have litigation pending against San Francisco over their sanctuary policy, and I expect we'll have even more as we proceed if these cities intend on continuing to violate the law. Taxpayers in some states have the ability to sue over this lawlessness, and we aim to pursue that. And just quickly on election integrity, tying it to immigration, and we have 20 million plus residents here in the United States, both lawful and unlawful, who are aliens, meaning they're not citizens.
Yep.
And President Trump has gotten into some trouble because he said millions of them may have voted. Well, I looked at this Old Dominion University study out of Virginia, which has, I know, been under attack by the left, but the study authors stand by it, and they did an analysis, and they said that there's a good percentage that vote. About 6.4% in the presidential election they looked at in 2008. Back of the envelope calculation, that's depending on which number you use for the number of aliens here in the United States, 800,000 to 1.5 million. And about 80% of them tend to vote Democrat. So is it millions of people who voted illegally? I don't know. But certainly a large number. The left would have you believe out of those 20 million, only 12 voted. A few dozen voted. And obviously that's not true. So I think Trump is brighter than he thinks. And voter ID is almost like yesterday's news. We need, and Congress might be able to take steps here to allow, and states want to do this, they need to be allowed by the Justice Department to seek some citizenship verification before you register to vote.
We had the Secretary of State from Kansas testify last year in front of the Oversight Committee. They have voter ID in their state, and they actually found, because the left's argument always is, well, if you force people to show ID, you'll depress turnout. They actually found in Kansas, turnout went up, which I would argue means that people feel like even more secure in the security and the fairness of the election, and they're showing up to vote. So he testified under oath that turnout went up. It's the right thing to do. People know it, and we should make sure it happens and push for it as much as we can.
I've never understood why you need an ID to get into the Justice Department.
Yeah.
But we have about 2 minutes left, and I want to cover this brief topic with General Meese. The judiciary, stealing our right to govern ourselves, the corrupt gay marriage decision. The president has an opportunity to appoint at least one member to the Supreme Court immediately upon entering office or nominating one member. What's your thinking on how that's going to proceed? Do you see good things happening?
I'm very optimistic. The president has already said that he wants to appoint judges throughout the federal judiciary. Because remember, the other courts, the federal appellate courts, the district courts are equally important to the Supreme Court in this sense. Almost all cases are decided below the Supreme Court. They have maybe less than 100 each year. But so the entire federal judiciary is important to have judges who will follow the Constitution and the laws as they actually read, and not substitute for what the law says and what the Constitution says, their own political ideas, their personal prejudices, or their policy preferences. And that's absolutely critical. The president-elect has said that he will appoint those kind of judges. He used, as an example, Antonin Scalia as the kind of judge he would like to appoint. So I think that bodes well for the judiciary.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us here today. There's a lot to discuss, obviously, but you heard it. The branches of government all need to be fixed here in Washington. Congress needs to take a new approach. Impeachment ain't a bad idea. Obviously, the judicial branch needs reform with better appointees. And then, of course, the executive branch. Many fires have been set on the horizon by the left and President Obama, and President Trump needs to send out fire teams to them all, in our view. And if he can't do it, Judicial Watch will be there independently prosecuting and exposing the government corruption that the politicians here in Washington don't want you to know about. Thanks for joining in, and we'll see you next time. Have a great week.